Thanks everybody for attending the talk today. As that introduction alluded to, we're talking about hardware hacking. I think the title of the talk was reverse engineer all the IOTs, and that's basically what we did, so we'll get into that in a second. Just a quick little introduction of who we are so you know. I'm Jerry, I'm on the left, I work at MUSC currently. Also, I'm in the DSU doctoral program. I like beer, I'm married, and I have kids, so that's good stuff.
I'm Tyler, do a little bit of red teaming, some software development, also an adjunct instructor at DSU as well as a full-time doctoral student there. Also heavily involved with Gen Cyber, for those of you familiar with that.
And I'm Cory. I'm a lecturer at Coastal Carolina University, Department of Computing Sciences, and also a doctoral student with these guys, and yeah, that's about it. Done some research on contents.
Okay, so high level, what are we doing here? So basically, as I kind of mentioned, each of us selected a IoT device, different devices, and basically we're kind of given carte blanche to just tear it apart, get into it, see what we could find, see if we could find any 0 days or undocumented vulnerabilities, how far we could push it with any tools that we had access to. Obviously, we were focused on finding vulnerabilities. But any part of the device, whether it was the hardware itself, the board, the software, the firmware, the OS, any network traffic coming off it, everything was pretty much game. I'm pretty sure all three of us were able to fully compromise the device in one way or another. So that was pretty cool. I should, in full disclosure, like I originally had started, I did a network attached storage device, but I originally had started with a like wireless lock that they have, like you can walk up and scan it and the door lock will go. I spent like 3 weeks on that and couldn't get anywhere, so I admitted defeat and then went for like a way easier target with this network attached storage device. So, okay, so why do we even care about IoT devices? I'm sure, given the audience in this room, you're all very aware that IoT devices are like a hot mess right now. They're easy to attack. Vendors aren't spending a lot of money protecting them. They're spending a lot of money marketing them and putting cool features that sell. Not, security doesn't sell. The Mirai botnet, as we all know, had those hard-coded vendor passwords built right in. And if you don't know, that botnet just scans basically the internet looking for these IoT devices and then tries the default creds and sees if it can own it. And then the newest version, the IoT Reaper, that's just recently this month, is using the same Mirai framework basically and checks those creds, but it also checks, I think, for 9 different vulnerabilities as well and exploits them if it can. And as I mentioned, economics of information security dictates that vendors aren't going to spend any money to invest in security because there's no return on that investment. Why do we do this?
So the reason why we all kind of had different devices, we were all in a reverse engineering class as part of our requirements for a doctoral degree. It was taught by Dr. Gerald Auger. And basically at the beginning of the course, he said, you guys have 2 or 3 weeks to identify some device that you want to go after, want to attack, and then basically let us loose and said, go for it. And kind of we had open discussion in the class about kind of what everyone was doing the weeks leading up to it, and then every week we kind of had like an update to the class that we had to have, so it's kind of where all this IoT work comes from. And it's kind of why we all have different devices too.
Okay, so now the actual meat, right? So, we basically, Tyler, you selected
Yep.
the Wemo Insight, right?
Yep. So I went after the hardware specifically. It was kind of my mentality going in. I did look at some of the software sides of things a little bit, but not too much. So I thought hardware is going to be a little bit different for me. It's not my experience, not my background. As I assume many of us in this room, right, a lot of us probably have more experience on the software side of things. So I wanted to spend time learning about, how do you go about attacking hardware? How do you go about extracting the firmware and things like that? So the Wemo Insight, if you're unfamiliar with this device, it's basically just a Wi-Fi connected plug in the wall so you can control the power to whatever you plug into it, right? So one of the reasons why I chose this is consumer hardware. You can go down to Best Buy, you can pick it up for like $40 right now. Second reason, because it is $40, like I was going after the hardware, I didn't care if I bricked it, right? And I knew I was going to be plugging stuff in, playing with the multimeter, things like that. So if I bricked it, not a big deal. I can go get another one pretty easily. Also, like I said before, in the first couple weeks, we had an open discussion throughout the class, and started to see this trend of a lot of our classmates going for things like IP cameras and knockoff, things like that. And I wanted to try something else. And then the last reason is because as a Wemo device, if you're unfamiliar with Wemo, it's kind of a software platform. So I kind of had this theory in my head about if you can pop one Wemo device, you can get them all, right? So I think Belkin has 8 or 9 products. And then Wemo is actually implemented on more brands as well. So all I really wanted to do was like own your Wi-Fi connected crock pot at home, so I could like turn it off while you're trying to cook dinner, right? More seriously though, like there's a lot of these different devices, and I think if you go, if you take a neighborhood, take 10 houses, they're more likely to have any one of them than just the specific one I looked at. So I really wanted to take a look at the Wemo stuff.
I have 2 in my house.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So first things first, like after going to pick it up, basically set up the device, play with it. I started figuring out what was the important functionality, how it was talking out. So what features you need to enable to get the critical functionality working. So for instance, the cloud connected port, right? The part that allows you to remotely monitor the device or change it from like outside your house while you're at work or whatever. That's not enabled by default, so kind of playing around with that, seeing what's available to you. There are a few other things, a few other options that come with the app that are worth looking at, but like I said, more towards the hardware side. So teardown, one thing I kind of found that was really interesting as I was starting to do research on how to go about tearing apart these hardware devices is stickers are really interesting. So in the lower left, it's kind of small, but you can see like I peeled the sticker off, and that was actually hiding the screws. But you'll come to find that in a lot of other cases, stickers will actually hide other things like debugging ports on the back of devices. So if you just pull the sticker off, sometimes you actually find debugging ports that you can actually connect to. You don't even have to go through the following steps to like connect to it with your JTagulator, your bus pirate, or whatever to start pulling things off of it. So obviously being careful is one thing. I was pretty careful. I almost still broke it when I was starting to pull the shell apart. You can kind of see in that top left picture that there's two separate boards. So in some devices, the boards sit across from each other on the shell, and they're connected through some wires. I actually almost pulled those apart and broke it when I was taking it apart. And then once you actually get it apart, there's information everywhere in there, right? There's no people developing these aren't trying to hide that, right? So on the left, it's pointing to supports, really, and to me that looks like 4 open unused ports in a row, right, with some text next to them. The text is kind of irrelevant. Never really found anything with that, but to me that just screams debugging ports, right? So I'm thinking, all right, we're gonna try to get a serial connection to this device. It might be running something like OpenWRT, and OpenWRT is pretty famous right now for always having default creds. So that's probably one of the first things I went after. In the middle there, you start to see some chips with some writing on there. So the raw link RT5350 chip. It's basically the system. It runs a whole bunch of different things on it. The next one is a WinBond chip that I didn't really look into. On the right is a small chip. I'll actually get into that one later. And once you start looking at this information, right, we start doing our OSINT, start looking around the internet. So we start to find the product sheets for these different chips. So the RT5350 chip, and then that WinBond chip. This is actually the spec sheet for the small one that was on the right there, and that one's a little bit more important later on. So electricity, it started with the debugging ports, right? I mentioned earlier that we want to go after a serial connection, try to connect to it, try to get on it, maybe get an easy route on it. So basically what I did is took a multimeter and started poking around, right? Just trying to find out what the resistance, or where I could find resistance, or where I could find electricity flowing through those debugging ports. So if I could find something flowing from one to one, or one side to a different probe, you can kind of start to assume like, okay, this one might be transmit, this port might be the ground, and you can kind of flip back and forth based on the information you get, and you don't need to have it powered on to do that. So This is the part where I'd really recommend having a little bit better setup than I did, because I started doing this and I was just kind of holding it in my hand and it wasn't really easy to do. Some test probes would have been really nice at the time. And then after a while, kind of poking around, checking for resistance, and then actually powering it on and looking for current, things like that, I was actually able to identify which ports were which. So the top one was the ground, the third one down was the receive, and the bottom was the transmit. The second one is actually a way to power the board without actually plugging it in. So the fourth one there, the second one down, I was actually able to pull another jumper off the tool I show next and basically power this little board. So this is just a portion of the entire thing. I was actually able to power it on and actually get a serial connection without having to have the whole thing, put back together and plugged in against the wall and doing that sort of thing. So to do that, we have the Bus Pirate. So the Bus Pirate's basically just a prototyping board. It's good for testing stuff. It allows you to basically take a USB from your computer to the mini USB on the board, and then you have that little header there, so you have the 10 different pins to jump off of, and they do different things. So I like the way that Dangerous Prototypes, the people who make it, describe it, basically a hacker multi-tool that talks to electronic stuff, right? So it talks to things like JTAG and UART and I2S or I2C and SPI and a handful more. So when I got my Bus Pirate, I had some assumptions, right? Kind of my limited knowledge of hardware. The transmit on the Bus Pirate goes to the receive, vice versa on the next one down, and then maybe just power and ground. So my assumption was actually right in the beginning, right? So I was actually sitting there holding this device in my kitchen. I plugged or stuck some jumpers in, and I was actually able to get it powered up. But on my screen, right, we see this read, and then we see UART, and then you tap F, and then you see this bytes drop thing, and the number kind of varies. So at this point, it's one of those frustrating moments of I thought I had this, and then all of a sudden this bytes dropped, and I'm not seeing what I thought I would see, right? I was thinking okay, it's gonna be a serial connection, kind of like when you pop into a Cisco router or something like that. But that took a little bit more research. So after learning about the bytes drop, actually before figuring out what it actually meant, I was kind of playing around with it and holding my hand and see things like it's a different length. A bunch of them will pop up and it'll kind of pause, and then a bunch more will pop up. So it looks like post data to me, right? And then after some more research, look at something called buffer overrun errors. So what that is, basically once the buffer fills up that it's reading from, it just drops the bytes without actually printing the screen, unless you use, I think it's the R option to read them onto the screen. But otherwise, to actually get to a real serial shell, there's something called the UART macro. So this macro basically uses a transparent macro to put it into a mode that allows it to talk just like serial on a Cisco device. So when you plug in something like that, you get a prompt. You see all the post data, all the different stuff happenings, and you can type to it and all those sorts of things. So actually, after figuring that out, I was actually able to get a serial connection to work, and I was right about assuming that was OpenWRT. I found that on it, got to that prompt. There wasn't a default password, so that was pretty disappointing. Because I was kind of thinking, what about boot mode, right? So as it's running up, I'm mashing 4 to jump into this different mode, look at the environment variables, things like that, and try to mess around with those. Nothing really came of that. So then I went back, kind of up the rabbit hole a little bit more, back to that other chip. So that other little small chip, it's WinBond and then some big long number. And then some more data out of those data sheets that I showed you earlier. I showed you the headers earlier. So these were actually really important. What I'm about to do next about learning about how this chip works, some of the things that are required for it. So one or two really important ones that I didn't know that I needed at the time, right? I thought I needed to use ground, power, transmit, and receive. It actually needs the chip select input, and it also needs the clock input. Right? Otherwise, you can't power on this little chip. So after figuring that all out, you get a test clip. Right, and there are test clips designed specifically for chips like that. You stick it on, and then you kind of see my setup. After it came off the ribbon from the test clip, I put it over to a breadboard and then jumped it to the Bus Pirate, and that went to my laptop. I was actually able to finally, after a lot of debugging on this, right, I trying to figure out which pins go where and having the spec sheet to know which pins were which ones. In the top, in the first one, you see that it says Winbond flash chip sort of in the middle, and then it says the chip name, and then it says no operations are specified. So that was like a successful connection was made, but I didn't tell it to do anything. And that was like a CTF get the flag moment, right? That was like, I finally got something. And then I just told it to read and dump to a binary file. And then you can see reading flash sort of at the bottom there, bottom left. So that actually took a lot longer than I thought it was going to take. And then eventually, once it's done, you can do a bin walk on it. And you can see that I actually got down to the images on it, the binary data, and from here I was actually able to extract the entire file system. Right? And at that point, I started to look at the software side of things, so I started to pull some of the binaries off, started to look at the configs that were on it, some of the data. But that's more for the software side, and I'll let Jerry and Cory talk about a little bit what they did there.
Oh, cool. All right. So, moving on. So I attacked a network attack attached storage device. I've redacted the vendor because I don't know the degree of how cool these fines are or whatever, but I just wanted to avoid like this being televised and then getting an email from the vendor. So if you really want to know what vendor it is, you probably could figure it out based on some of the slides I have, but there's like a, whatever, an attempt at redaction here. So you can see here, like just as a high level, my lab setup was fairly mundane. This is the device itself, pretty simple. I've got a Cisco switch with a span port feeding into a laptop running Wireshark just so I can watch the traffic, because there is traffic that goes out to the internet. And then there's my like research laptop for doing all sorts of stuff. So initially, I was very fortunate. Again, I said that I tried to do like a lock first, and then that was a little too challenging, so I went for a slightly easier target like this. This vendor was really convenient for its end user population to post its firmware on their website. So I was able to pull that firmware down. Now, it's worth noting that it isn't a complete cakewalk, because the firmware is only partial. Like when you boot the device up and run it, it actually starts building out another piece of its file system structure, and it reaches out to the internet to pull down some files. So it wasn't a complete pwn right there. But so I get the firmware, and I'm able to run bin walk on it, right? So I run bin walk on it. Oh, this slide looks terrible in this, huh? So if you could read this, you'd be seeing that it's actually like identifying the file system. I actually used DD to carve off this first row, and then for some unknown reason, which took a lot of troubleshooting and like irritation and frustration, you basically, when you DD off that top row, it's the actual file system for the NAS device. But it's actually in a gzip format, so you just have to basically unzip it, which, like, that's the frustration, because I thought that was the image when I pulled it down, and then eventually I figured out that it was an archive version. So anyways, I pull it down, and then I've got the firmware, and I can actually look at it. And at that point, is it going to be the next one? Yeah, so at that point, I have most of the file system for this network attached storage device. Again, I've just downloaded the firmware from the vendor. I don't own the actual NAS at this point, even though my lab looked like it. And I was able to find the shadow account on the file system. So let me actually just jump immediately. So for those, just a quick little thing, like in shadow file, that's where the passwords are basically, except they're hashed. So the format is, it's the username, so Jerry, and then the algorithm that was used to hash it, your password, the salt applied to the password, and then the actual hash password. So you can see in the file system that I had, is this it? Yeah, so root, the account root, right? Basically, $1 is MD5, which is like the worst hash. And then there's no salt, convenient, right? And then there's the hash password. So basically they use like a really broken hash and no salt. So I pulled the two entries from the shadow file, one called admin and one called root, and just ran John the Ripper on it. It took like I thought it actually didn't work, because it took less than a second. Like it immediately just spit out, and the username and password were 1234. So that was like, thanks vendor, right? Like super terrible password. So anyway, so now I have the root password. I try to do a little bit more, and I realized that the firmware is missing like an entire piece of the system, like it just doesn't make sense. Like I'm confused. So I try to, I didn't put this in my slides, but there's this thing called, how do you pronounce it? Qemu? Like, you know what I'm talking about? QEMEU. It's basically a processor emulator, effectively, and you can use it like, everybody has Intel chips or whatever, but there's these IoT devices are using like kind of weird processors or, you know, weird chips and stuff. So anyways, this software emulates it. I tried like hell to get it to work, and after like 3 days, I just went on Amazon and bought the NAS device because it figured it'd be so much easier, which it was, thankfully. Right. So then I get the NAS device, and I can just get right in and get with root access to the OS underneath. So other kind of findings that I have some slides to, this is more like a high-level thing. As I mentioned, the passwords are stored insecurely. The root account, 1234 is the password. There's a backdoor application, so this one's kind of juicy, right? It's literally called openbackdoor.sh. It's not accessible from the front end, and it literally relies on a UPnP library it reaches out to your basically your router, like, so, you know, your Comcast router, the thing that pushes you to the internet, and attempts to use UPnP to open up an SSH tunnel or a listening SSH process. There's a lot of reliance on third-party apps. I don't know if this is even a finding or not, but it's worth noting. So like this has Linux on it, but it's like Linux 3 or something. It's like, you know, several versions old. It runs BusyBox to run a lot of its. BusyBox allows you to kind of encapsulate lighter versions of the standard Unix binaries, and that was like a really old version. So there's tons of vulnerabilities already published for a lot of these third-party softwares that the system's relying on. So even if the vendor patched their server, they'd have all these like horrible exploitable vulnerabilities from their other apps. And then there's a whole bunch of private keys that I found just for fun. Okay, so I already talked about that. Oh, look at that, I put little arrows in there. I just thought this was worth noting. So like if you look at this vendor, their documentation they give you and everything, they're like, oh yeah, we have FTP and we have Telnet, I think was another one, and something else. But like as soon as you turn it on, like all these other open ports are just running, like listening. You know, so like if someone wants to tell me what black ice alerts is, I don't know what that is, but I found it interesting that there's a ton of undocumented listening services that you can kind of interface with on the device just by default. There's world readable config files where they actually store passwords in the clear. So I enabled like dynamic DNS on this one because I actually used Shodan and found several of these devices on the internet, and I was like maybe I'll see if I can exploit someone's thing, and then I was like, oh, I like my job, so I was like, oh, maybe I'll configure it and then hack myself, which I was like, I don't know if there's any value there, but anyways, the clear text password's not the best practice again, vendor. Here's that open backdoor thing I was telling you about. I think I have a little shout out here. So this is in a CGI file called remotehelp.cgi, which is inaccessible from the front end in general. But you can see here it calls openbackdoor.shell. It passes it some parameters. And we'll look at the source code of that in a second because it's a shell file, right? So it's clear text. But you can see, you can kind of see here, I know there's a lot of garbly-gook here, but basically it'll add, and we'll see this in the shell script, it'll add a new account to the shadow file called NSA Rescue Angel. Now, let's just assume, I had to assume that was a typo and they meant NAS Rescue Angel, but it's still wicked suspicious, right? Where this undocumented, unlisted program called Open Backdoor creates an account called NSA Rescue Angel, So here's the code. I know it's tough to see. I'm sorry. I wasn't really sure how this was going to work, but this is from the shadow file. You can see it created it. Now, what's interesting is right now that account isn't, you can't log in as that account right now. But if you look in the code, it basically creates a copy of the shadow file, uses the first couple of things to create a key for that account, pushes it into the shadow file, and then basically checks to see if SSH is running. If it's not, it starts it. Sees if Telnet's running. If it's not, it starts it. So, you know, you tell me what that's doing. It seems pretty clear what they were doing there, but maybe they have maybe it's like how they do tech support, but they just forgot to tell that consumer that that's a feature. And then, yeah, I probably should have redacted some of this. I guess if someone really wanted to type this out, but they just got private keys, which I assume you can see in the next slide. I did want to point out some positive things this vendor did, not just be a total wet blanket. So if you go to their APIs that they interface with, the device does to pull things, they are doing a great job, at least from kind of a encryption transmission protection perspective. They got A+ from Qualys's SSL labs. So that's not terrible. And I think the private key is used in establishing that connection. One of the things I wanted to do, we have a future work slide, but one of the things I wanted to do was set up kind of a man-in-the-middle thing where I basically pretended to be the device and then connected up to that API to see what kind of functionality was provided. I messed with it a little bit, but I got frustrated and then I ran out of time, so unfortunately I didn't do that. So, yeah, okay. Oh, and then just a couple, I probably already touched on these. Like, I tried fuzzing as well. I don't know if anyone's got any experience with fuzzing, but it's like, I don't know, it's kind of like forensics almost, where you almost like have to be, that's what you do, and you're really good at it, or you just terribly suck at it. I don't know if that's the case in general, but I tried fuzzing for like probably 15 hours, like over the course of a couple days, and got nowhere, like just a bunch of crappy results. And then that emulator thing, I just spent $150 to buy a NAS to get around that. And this device could fall to Mirai because the admin password is 1234. And it definitely would file to IoT Reaper because there's a bunch of vulnerabilities on it. So, Cory?
Cool. So I decided to attack my router because, like Tyler said, a lot of people were doing IP cameras and stuff like that. And I just happened to have a TP-Link Archer C7 V2. So it's just your run-of-the-mill consumer wireless router you can pick up at Best Buy or something like that. This particular one was released in 2013. It's got your standard like 4 LAN ports, WAN port, 2 USBs for like printer sharing or mass hard drive, something like that. The hard drive, or not the hard drive, the hardware, it's a MIPS-based processor. It's using a Qualcomm Altheros system on a chip. It's locked at around 720 megahertz, 128 megabytes of RAM, and a little bit of flash memory. So my strategy for going about this was to start off with some open source research, find out what all was out there. This was like the 6th iteration of the firmware, so there was a lot of other vulnerabilities that had already been discovered and hopefully fixed. They weren't all addressed in the change log, so I went and tested some of those. Then network scanning, see what services are running, what can we connect to. From there, I went into some web application scanning, a little bit of binary analysis, and then at the end, I'll talk about the smartphone application that allows you to administer it as well. So with the open source research, there was a few different vulnerabilities, like I mentioned. The two that really stuck out was the CVE 2015 3035 and 3036. So 3035 was a directory traversal with the HTTP server. I tested that with a script in netstat, not vulnerable anymore, so that's good. And then 3036 was a stack-based buffer overflow in the Kcode's net USB kernel module. I found a proof of concept on exploitdb.com, tried it, and it didn't appear to work, or it failed. I don't know if the POC, 100% worked all the time, but from what I could tell, that vulnerability was patched as well. So that's just a screenshot of netstat using one of their scripts to check that directory traversal. The next thing I did was go onto the vendor site. There's a wealth of information that they provide to us as far as being able to download the firmware. Didn't have to have a password or anything to do that. And then right below that, something that's pretty neat is you can download the GPL code for some of the software that the vendor's using on there. So with the firmware, used binwalk to extract the file systems, and wasn't too surprised. It's just your standard Linux file system there. I was able to kind of poke around in it, look in the etc directory, and this RCS file is sort of like the startup script files in the etcrc.d directory, and I like that the vendor, or the developers for it, put some comments in here that really helped me narrow down what I was going to look at. So start our router program right there on 34. I know it's kind of hard to read. So these two binaries right here were particularly of interest, and that's what I got into with the binary analysis later on here in the slides. And then also I found like the static web pages. I got the etc password file, the shadow file, and those were just the default credentials, admin. You could pretty much look those up in the documentation. And then the GPL code, with this I was able to look and see what all was the firmware using as far as software, and then also what version of the software it was using. So with that, I did some poking around to try to figure out, are there any CVs for those that maybe aren't particularly associated with the router. So next I just did a nmap scan. Not too much open. FTP, I had to turn that on, but I wanted to test it. I also had the version number of it, which eventually leads to a CV I'll talk about here in a second. And then SSH was open, so I was really interested in trying to connect over SSH. A little bit of problems with that. And then HTTP was for the administration. So jumping back just real quick to the VSFTP program, that was vulnerable to the CVE from 2011, 0762, and it's just a denial of service attack. But I was able to find exploit code for it on exploitdb.com and successfully used that vulnerability. So that's what the screenshot's showing. Once you use that, it essentially makes the VSFTP think that too many people are connected, and it'll just deny everyone else access. So with the SSH, I knew that I had the username and I had the password. I knew it was the Dropbear SSH server from the GPL code as well as from the nmap scan. But every time I tried to SSH into it, it would give me this PTY allocation request failed, and basically couldn't open up a terminal on it. So I wasn't really sure what to do for a while with that. I did some searching around on the internet, and it turns out that the smartphone app called Tether, this is the way that it communicates. And later on I was able to dig in and find out that it uses port forwarding. So if you use port forwarding and this -n and tell it not to try to create a shell or anything, it'll just enable port forwarding, and my local port, in this example 8080, would forward to localhost 8080 on the router. Okay, so next I tried to do some web application scanning. A lot of vulnerabilities were found in the web application. There was like a command injection that I tried. That one had been fixed. And basically I did some vulnerability scans and really didn't find much. Like a lot of it had to do with cross-site scripting attacks. And the vendor, when you connect to the administration portal, it generates this random URL every time. So I figured that did a pretty good job of stopping any cross-site scripting attacks. That part in yellow is always going to be something different every time you connect. So with those two router programs, I did a little bit of binary analysis, and the uclited was, it would load up configuration data. If the configuration data wasn't there, then it would create it. It basically had that hard-coded in it. It would also handle firewalls and routes. And then the HTTPD, I assumed from the beginning that was the web server, right? But it did a little bit more than that. It also handled the server-side logic for the web page, and then it launched all of these other daemons as well, like SSH, these two guys are, one of them is for TP-Link debugging, and then this one is used by the Tether smartphone application. So just real briefly walking through that process, usually start off by looking at the strings of different binaries. So out of uclited, I was looking through it and I saw all these IP tables and ifconfig and routes adds and routes deletes and things like that. And then I could find in the code where it was actually calling that and making that happen, as well as the function that loads up the default settings, or also pulls the settings like what Jerry was talking about, how it creates this extra files on the file system as it's loading up. It pulls that out of NVRAM. So that kind of clued me into what that was doing. And then with HTTPD, I found that every static web page that I found in the firmware had a corresponding function inside of HTTPD, and basically that was the server-side logic of serving that up. It would open up the static page and then return it back. And then this was the part that I found interesting, was during the startup of HTTPD, it would go through, and this is just a snippet of a big long function, but it would start all of these different services as it was going through. I did try to use qemu, if that's how you pronounce it, not really sure. So qemu, I tried to use that. My intentions were to do a little bit of fuzzing on HTTPD and uclited, but what I found out was I can't emulate the NVRAM, or I'm sure I could if I really spent a ton of time on it, but ended up getting seg faults when I tried to run it, or it would tell me that the IO control failed because it couldn't load up from the address that it was looking for. One of these talked about it. Read from config flash failed, things like that. So I abandoned that part and just kind of moved on to the smartphone application, because I thought it was pretty neat that you can install this app. You wouldn't have to use the web portal, and you could just use this Tether app to do everything that you could normally do through the web portal. So this was just an alternative way. Like I said, it communicated over SSH using port forwarding, and it uses the same credentials as the web app. So the way that I went about analyzing that was I got a copy of the APK and I decompiled it. That's how I found out that it uses SSH and port forwarding. And then I went through the process of man-in-the-middling SSH. So what I did was I forwarded my own port 20,002 to the router's port 20,002 on my machine, and that's the port that the TMPD is listening on for Tether. I used this SSH man in the middle from JTesta to man in the middle that attack, and then ARP spoof to target my cell phone, and then I just waited for Tether to connect on it, did a little packet capture, and I could see the protocol in plain text of what was going on. So this is just a screenshot of a snippet of the decompiled APK. It was partially obfuscated, so it made it kind of a pain to step through it, but not all of it was obfuscated, and there was obviously some nice debugging messages in here that helped me understand what was going on and trace through it. This is the packet capture in plain text, and we can see that it is like sending what all clients are connected, their MAC address, and this is basically when you first log in and it tells you all of your guests and stuff like that. So I found this tool called NetZob that's used for trying to reverse engineer protocols, doing protocol analysis. And this is kind of where I left off with the project. Was I was trying to figure out what was the grammar and the vocabulary for that protocol, and was there anything in it that I could try to take advantage of. So I got it kind of grouped up into different areas. I believe that this was a CRC checksum, and I basically ran out of time, and I just haven't had time to pick it back up since then. But as far as future work, that's the direction that I would want to
keep sort of pushing in is figuring out what all is this protocol about.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about that.
yeah, at the end, any of us in the class that found vulnerabilities, we did do a responsible disclosure. We contacted US CERT. Dr. DeMott helped us out with that. A lot of it didn't really go too far, and I felt like my project never really got finished, so I didn't pursue following up with TP-Link at the time, just to let them know that I could see their protocol or something like that, or that they were vulnerable to a 2011 CVE. But I don't know how y'all's went.
I didn't disclose anything.
Yeah, I was going to, and then I was just like, oh,
Yeah.
I don't want to. I don't really have a good explanation other than, yeah.
It's a lot of work to be responsible.
Yes, it is harder than just sending them your report and saying, good luck, you know, so.
Right. So for future work, obviously, I would pick up with that protocol analysis. We're also interested in looking at similar tech. We had those discussions throughout the course, and really a lot of the problems and issues and things we were finding were similar across all of the devices that everyone in the class was trying to tackle. So in conclusion, it seems like these IoT device manufacturers are just trying to push out devices really quick, and security is sort of the last thing on their mind. And a good takeaway from this is that it's really important that you keep up with your firmware and try to stay on top of updating it so that you're not vulnerable to these types of CVEs either. Any questions?